Hey friends, in this video I want to show you how I made the drawers for my new kitchen, and at the end of the video I'm going to share some footage of my completed kitchen. I've always been a fan of nice maple and walnut kitchen drawers that when you pull out you can see the pretty dovetail joinery, and I said, you know what, this would be a cool project to tackle on. This will be my first time ever making drawers and really using this jig. So in the next few shots you're going to see me running my maple boards through my planer, milling all the boards down to 3/4 of an inch. All the walls of the drawers are going to be 3/4 of an inch. Then I moved over to my miter saw, rough cutting all the boards to what their approximate lengths are going to be. I think for all the depths I ended up going with 21-22 inches, which is what I mirrored off of the original drawers that were in the cabinets. Your standard cabinet is usually 24 inches, so this gives you a few inches before hitting the back wall. I upgraded my dust collector to a Laguna dust collector. This thing is badass. If you notice in any of my previous videos, my old dust collector was wall mounted, kind of a Frankenstein between a couple different brands that I owned in the past, but this thing with the trash can pullout is a game changer. So here I am again, milling down all my walnut boards to the same thing, 3/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to start ripping everything down to a rough cut. My goal was to have all four sides of every drawer milled down to their final dimensions, so when I was ready to use the dovetail jig, I can really concentrate my time on using the jig properly and knocking out all the drawers in one shot. I used maple for all the sides of the drawers, and I chose walnut for the fronts and backs. And here's another cool shot of the dust collector doing its job. It's incredible how much dust you produce when you're milling down this much wood, so it's really nice having a quick way to dispose of it. And here's me using my joiner. What it basically does is it runs the edge of that board across a blade, giving me a nice perpendicular angle to the plain side of my board. Most of my drawers, with the exception of about 3, were 4 inches tall, so I set my table saw at 4 inches and ran all my boards through. So the sides of my drawers, all the maple pieces were all the same depth or length. The walnut pieces, where the fronts and backs were dependent on the width of that specific drawer opening. So using the old measurements from the original drawers, I copied that to the walnut pieces and ripped everything back down to its final dimensions to match. So this is my laid D4 dovetail jig, and I'm going to use this to make the drawer ends. This is where you make your selection on what you want the tails and pins to look like. I kind of went with a very even distribution on the pins, just to make things easy. After reading a really long manual on how to use this thing, I did a couple practice shots before I filmed this video, and I'm going to start with my tails. So all my tails are going to run through this exact same jig configuration, and I'm going to use a 1/2 inch dovetail bit on my Bosch router to carve out all the tails on each end of the board. So now it's time to cut the pins. And the pins are the part that slides into the tails, so one way or another, to give us a perfect drawer. Now this is a piece that I already used, and I routed out just to make sure that all my cuts are going to fit. I'm happy with the way the setup came out. Everything lined up pretty flush. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut it out. Well, I'm going to cut out all the rest of the pins for all the drawers, and then we can start assembling. And to cut the pins, instead of using the dovetail bit, I'm going to be using a straight edge bit. The great part about this is once you have your tail set up, all you really have to do is flip your jig over to the pin side, and since you haven't adjusted the space between your tails, your pins should match perfectly. You just want to make sure that your router is set to the right depth, in this case being 3/4 of an inch, because the tails and the pins are both getting cut into 3/4 of an inch boards. You always want to do a quick dry fit of the boards to make sure nothing came uncalibrated while you are guiding your router around the jig. I decided to cut the dados that's going to support the bottom tray of my drawers, using one of the bits from my style and rail kit that I used to make my shaker cabinet doors. Here's a close-up of that bit. As you guide the board in front of that fence, it cuts a dado at the height that you set, which for me was about 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom of the drawer. I ran all 4 sides of each drawer through there, being very careful not to confuse the inside with the outside of the drawer. Here I am doing another quick dry fit just to make sure everything lines up. Double checking all my measurements and writing down all the sizes for the drawer bases. When working alone, these ball bearing roller stands are like having a second person there working with you. But it does help when you have an extra set of real hands to help you carry some of these large boards. I'm using a 4x8 board, birch, with a pre-finished side for all my drawer bases, just to make it a little bit easier for me when it comes to finishing. Some of the struggles of having a small shop. I sanded both sides of each drawer board with a 200 grit sandpaper to give me a nice soft finish. Titebond 3 is always my glue of choice. I spread it across all the pins and tails right before assembly to make sure I had a nice tight fit with good adhesive. After assembling everything with glue, I clamped everything down and gave it about 24 hours before I released the clamps to make sure everything was nice and tight and dry. Once all my drawers were dry, I unclamped everything and moved back to my router table, swapping out the dado bit with a roundover bit so I could round over all the outside edges of the drawers. I went back to my orbital sander with a 250 grit sandpaper and hit all sides of the drawers again and removed some of the burn marks that I got from my table saw when I was ripping my boards. Since I had so many drawers to finish and I was going to keep a lot of utensils and things like that were going to touch food, I decided to use a water-based polyacrylic to finish my drawers. The polyacrylic dries really quickly, so I'm able to give it an extra coat every few hours. I meant to record the installation of all the drawers and show you guys exactly how I got all the slides to line up and get squared. But to be honest, I pulled so many tantrums doing this thing, it was so frustrating that I really didn't have time to record it. It was very difficult to make sure everything aligned perfectly, especially with the slow close feature. If it's not perfectly square, the slow close function won't work. But after several hours, okay, maybe days, I was able to get them all lined up and slow closing. So I'm just gonna fast forward to the fun part once they're all installed.